Why do human beings commit evil acts? Why do we mistreat each other at home, on the road, or at work? Why do we rape, lie, and steal? Where did that impulse for evil come from?
Oh, how wonderful.
It's a question that has consumed Christian theologians and writers for as long as the faith has been around. We're all familiar with one answer. We sinned because Adam and Eve disobeyed in the Garden of Eden. Thanks to them, we're born with an inclination towards sin. This is the idea of original sin. It was championed by Augustine in the 5th century and became Catholic doctrine. For a long time, it was believed that babies who were born, if they died unbaptized, they were going straight to hell because they'd been born with that original sin in them, and nothing had saved them from being condemned to the fires of hell. It's an idea which has fallen into disfavor among theologians and congregants in the past century, and for good reason. But when Paul wrote the letter that Amanda just read out loud, the doctrine of original sin didn't exist yet. But evil did. That was obvious to Paul. In his world, masters raped their slaves with the full protection of the law. People went to games for fun, to watch prisoners and Christians get torn apart by wild animals and gladiators. Paul lived in a society that gloried in public violence and allowed it at home. Women had few rights and slaves had none. For Paul, the big question was why? Why did people commit so much cruelty and evil to each other? As a Jew, Paul had grown up knowing that humans were not created evil. That was not possible since God could only create good things. For Paul and other early Christians, the answer was that we were born good, but we were influenced to do evil. And that influence came from evil spirits. In Paul's time, Christians believed that evil spirits were fallen angels who had defied God in a war in heaven, a war that had started even before human beings were created. They fell to earth, and now they lived among us as invisible spirits, posing in Paul's time as pagan gods, Mars and Jupiter and Venus. They encouraged people to be selfish, to be angry, to be greedy, to go as far as murder. To Paul, the air was thick with evil spirits. They were invisible, and they were literally hell-bent on getting us to stray from God in the way of love. Paul saw them as cosmic forces, the powers and principalities of the world. Paul and his fellow Christians believed that everyone in the pagan world had been absorbing unseen evil spirits their entire lives. Back then, pagan mothers during pregnancy would strap on amulets onto their swelling bellies to invoke the protection of these gods so that the child would be born healthy. Once a child was born, parents would make sacrifices to their household gods to protect the child, and when the child became an adult, it was expected to make sacrifices pretty much daily. A dinner party would involve opening up a chicken, reading the entrails to try and predict the future, and then putting aside a little bit of the meat for your household god. The state expected sacrifices to be made on an annual basis to the emperor's god. People were sacrificing to pagan gods all the time. To Paul, that meant that that world was in the grips of cosmic evil forces, which made people cruel and insensitive and hateful to each other. The enemy, Paul said, was not human beings, people made of flesh and blood, as he says, but the evil forces which had led them astray. Now, today, all of this sounds ridiculous. We do not believe that the air is thick with evil spirits. But truth be told, the early Christians like Paul never claimed to have seen any of these evil spirits. They just deduced they must exist based on human behavior. Evil spirits made sense of human behavior, and in that sense, it may make sense to say that we too believe in invisible forces. Today, we don't talk about evil spirits much, but we do spend a lot of time talking about racism and sexism and homophobia, especially lately. Like evil spirits, you can't measure racism on a scale and you can't put it under a microscope. You can't see homophobia walking down the street. You can't capture it on a CCTV camera. These forces, which we talk so much about, are invisible, and yet we treat them as though they are absolutely real. Of course, we're more comfortable considering our hateful ideas as being something in our heads. Children are taught racist ideas and homophobic ideas, and then they absorb them and then pass them on in turn in culture and to their children. That's just sociology 101. But what's more perplexing is that these hateful isms seem to act as though they have a survival instinct. Racism keeps morphing to keep up with the times, from slavery to Jim Crow to the mass incarceration of Black people during the war on drugs. If you're interested in that, the movie The 13th, which we'll be talking about on Thursday night, deals with that in great detail. The fear and hatred of transgender people has proven remarkably resilient too. Over the years, it's morphed from discrimination against cross-dressers to the hatred and mistreatment of people who use hormones and surgery to change their gender. These medical treatments are truly new, only a few decades old, but the hatred of transgendered people has changed and adapted with each possibility, as though it was some kind of evil spirit eager to survive. This is Pride Sunday, a time when the LGBTQ two-spirited community will be celebrating the wonderful diversity of genders, queer genders, and sexuality. But it's a tough time to celebrate, of course. The annual Pride Parade has to be canceled because of the pandemic. And just 2 weeks ago in the United States, the Trump administration decided to remove health protections for transgendered people. This is part of a consistent policy of enabling employers to fire people who come out as gay or transgendered. In fact, 3 of those cases recently went to the Supreme Court, with the government arguing that queer sexuality and transgendered identity are not protected by the law. But on this Pride Sunday in the United States, many will be celebrating, because 1 week ago, the Supreme Court of the United States decided against the government's position. The court argued in favor of upholding queer and transgender rights in the workplace. No one expected this. As we know, Trump has been stacking the court with right-wing judges, so it seemed highly unlikely that a case like this would be decided in favor of queer people. The court based its decision on the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's the law which famously ended segregation in the South. It also famously stated that no one should lose their job because of their race, color, religion, or sex. The judges in their decision, this recent decision, admitted that in 1964, no one was thinking about transgender rights when the word sex was included in that list. But today we understand sex to mean more than just male and female. So the judges interpreted the meaning of the term broadly. This is a landmark ruling, one that has the potential to improve the lives of LGBTQ people for generations to come. From our vantage point, the 1964 Civil Rights Act seems to be proof that moral progress can be decided through legislation. If you want to change the world, change the laws. But the story of why the word sex was included in the Civil Rights Act suggests that real life is more complicated than that. The Civil Rights Act was President John F. Kennedy's idea, with a good deal of influence from Martin Luther King and his civil rights movement. Kennedy proposed it, got it written, but was killed before it could become law. His successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, was determined to get it passed, as a sort of legacy for Kennedy and also because he believed in it. Everyone knew it was a long shot. The white Southern politicians wouldn't want to give equal rights to African Americans. And one of them was this man, Congressman Howard Smith of Virginia. In 1964, he was 80 years old. He knew all the procedural tricks, and he served on a committee that adjudicated over what bills were allowed into Congress and whether they were properly framed. And he used all the tricks he knew of to try and keep the bill from even being read on the Congress floor. But when that failed, he tried to make the bill so outlandishly left-wing that it couldn't possibly pass. His strategy: he added the word sex to the bill. His revision meant that not only would blacks have equal rights in the workplace, but so would women. If the bill passed, it would prevent employers from firing women when they got pregnant or married, which was a common practice back then. Scholars digging through the archives have found that adding that word sex to the list was in fact part of a racist and sexist strategy. Men like Howard Smith, held deeply racist views about African Americans. Smith couldn't stand the idea that a white woman might not be hired when the bill gave more rights to black men and women. So far from being a piece of legislation which rose above racism and sexism, it was infused with it. The one thing Smith didn't want was for the blacks to be able to get an edge over the whites, even if that meant white women. It was a fusion of sexist and racist ideas. But much to Smith's surprise, the addition of the word sex did not doom the bill. The pressure to respond to the civil rights movement was so strong that the bill became law just 2 days later. The last-minute addition of the sex into the legislation was reflected in the way it was enforced. The government simply didn't see it as a priority. The government had pushed for this bill so that it could start to help Black people in the United States. But what the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission found, which was newly founded for this bill, was that 1/3 of the complaints they were getting were from women. And the government didn't have much interest in helping them. They assigned a temp, literally a temp, to oversee all of those complaints. And when gay and transgender people sought to use the bill's protection in the 70s and 80s, the courts usually ruled against them. Judges declared that the word sex meant male and female, and it didn't apply to sexuality or transgender people. But times change, and how laws are interpreted change too. In the 1990s and 2000s, the meaning of the word sex has broadened. Judges began to rule that the Civil Rights Act did provide protection to gay and transgendered people. But what had happened? The law's wording hadn't changed. It was still just that little word sex. But the spirit of the times had shifted. How we see each other has evolved. The fruit of decades of activism, parades, and debates within churches like ours over whether to allow gay ministers and same-sex weddings, these issues are ultimately not decided by legislation or law, but how we think about them. It's as if there's something in the air, a shift in how we see things, even though the words of the law haven't changed at all. These questions are ultimately spiritual issues. Spiritual because they're like spirits, ideas that are invisible, they seem to float, and they only have real power when they take up residence in people. And if these ideas of equality are spiritual matters, then Paul can help us understand the stakes. For Paul, when good and evil lock in battle, it is never an even match. God created a good world. That means everything that God creates is good, including us people, in all the variety of our skin colors, our genders, and sexualities. Evil spirits, by contrast, Paul would tell us, have no power to create anything. All they can do is deceive us, tell us that some people are less human than we are, less deserving of the good life. Paul saw spirits in all the people he met who wanted to become Christians. And he saw it in his Christian converts too. All of them had been possessed by spirits, influenced by spirits in one way or another over the years. And he knew that the fight against evil spirits is not won in a day or a week or a year, it's ongoing. The spirits don't all leave just because you're baptized. The enemy is not the people who carry the evil spirits, Paul says, but the powers and principalities, the spirits themselves. In our age, that's like saying racism is the enemy because it will keep changing to survive. It's like saying people are not the enemy, but the spirits and ideas they carry, spirits which can be dispelled. It's like saying every racist and homophobe is a potential ally. All of us may be harboring evil spirits. The challenge of the Christian life is admitting that and acting on it. Paul assures us that if we ask for God's help, we can put on holy armor to battle these forces. This is a contest God wants us to win, so we can see and enjoy the beauty of God's creation. There's a reason the pride symbol is a rainbow. We're invited to see in true living color the full, wonderful range of humanity God has made. That is our birthright as human beings, to love and respect each other in all our wonderful variety. Happy Pride. Amen.